Hey, everybody. Good afternoon. I'm Susan Kaufman. I'm here for Attitude Magazine's ADHD Experts webinar series. I want to welcome all of our listeners today, whether you're listening to the live webinar, listening to the podcast version, or watching their webinar replay. I think you'll find today's topic, how to create a healthy video game diet for your child with ADHD, to be an important one. And I'm very pleased to welcome back today Randy Kulman, Ph.D., and James Daley of Learning Works for Kids as our guest speakers. Let me introduce them. Randy Kulman is the founder and president of Learning Works for Kids, which is an educational technology company that specializes in video games and interactive digital media to teach executive functioning and academic skills. He's the author of books that I think you'd find interesting: Train Your Brain for Success, A Teenager's Guide to Executive Functions, and Playing Smarter in a Digital World. James Daley is a writer, editor, and digital designer with a passion for creative, innovative online media. He serves as vice president and editor-in-chief of Learning Works for Kids. You might want to check out their website, learningworksforkids.com. Thanks so much for both of you for being here today. I also want to thank our sponsor, Play Attention. Play Attention is the sponsor. We cannot do these webinars without our sponsors. We're grateful to Play Attention. It is a brain training product that enhances brain health and performance. It uses high technology, NASA-inspired technology to strengthen executive function and self-regulation skills. Play Attention will customize a plan and help you or your child thrive at home, school, and work. So you can learn how to make ADHD a superpower. If you want a free consultation, go to www.playattention.com or call 1-800-788-6786. Play Attention's having a special offer for Attitude listeners today. Mention Attitude Mag 0220 and you'll receive 10% off your home or professional program plus a free ADHD assessment. So let me just repeat that. Attitude Mag 0220 for 10% off. Play Attention, www.playattention.com or 1-800-788-6786. So without further ado, we'll get started. I just want to tell all of our listeners that the webinar replay page is generally up later. Will generally be up the same day as the webinar, and you can look for the podcast within 2 days. Podcast listeners, visit the webinar replay page if you'd like to view the slides that accompany this presentation. And if you want an attendance certificate, please look for the questions marked required for certificate at the end of the presentation in both the live and replay versions. You'll complete these and you'll receive a certificate via email. So with that, let me turn it over to Randy and James to jump right into our topic.
Okay. Thank you, Susan. This is Randy speaking now. I'm going to start off, and then James is going to jump in a little bit later. Before I start, I want to tell you a little bit about myself. The first thing I want to tell everyone is I am not a gamer. I'm a little bit too old to be a gamer, but I have always been interested in children's play. That was really how I got involved with looking at video games and technology. Since 1985, I've been a practicing clinical psychologist, primarily working with kids with ADHD. As I've done that, I've seen a lot of kids who love games and technology, and I want to kind of give you a little bit of a history of that. I'm going back into the 1990s. It was a kid by the name of Ryan. He was kind of a typical kind of ADHD kid in some ways. His parents brought him in, told me he didn't like to read. School was a struggle. He had some self-esteem issues. But boy, was he good at setting up the VCR. He was the kid that showed the family how to use the remote control. Remember when remote controls were sort of a newer thing? Well, some of you are old enough will remember that. He's the kid who loved Nintendo games. And he'd have his friends come over, and they would play in his house. They'd play Mario World or Legend of Zelda, those kinds of games that you could play multiplayer, but you had to be together. Move up about a decade and a half, and this is Jamie, a sixth grader. In the first year of middle school, really struggling, probably having a lot of executive functioning issues, always been a bit active, but a smart kid, did really well with school up until then, couldn't do things. Parents never even considered that Jamie might have had ADHD, except now he's in the sixth grade, teachers are starting to say it, and they bring the kid into me and say, my kid couldn't possibly have ADHD. You should see him focus on video games. I mean, and he's really social, and he's doing great things. He's learning from the games. He's playing Call of Duty. He's finding some new games on Steam. So he's out there doing things with his friends. He doesn't have ADHD. This is a story of Maya. Recently, just happened in my offices, maybe about a month and a half ago. Parents bring in this 10th grader, again, a good student, someone who's done pretty well in school. But the first thing the mom is saying to me is that her kid won't get off the phone. It's in the way of her homework and her sleep. She can't keep the phone away from her. They're actually having to take the phone away, lock the phone in their room. But even still, she manages to get it back sometimes. She's up all hours and she's not sleeping, which is one of the things that we're going to see is one of the concerns we have for kids with ADHD. She's taken forever to do her homework and she's totally distracted by her phone. So we're seeing these kinds of things. And again, there's a lot of connection with kids with ADHD. Now, before I move on to the next slide, I just want to say something. We're going to be talking about screen time here. Some of the research that we'll touch on has more to do with video games, but it's vitally important that people recognize that all screen time is not alike. Next. So what we find is that most digital play is good. Too much is bad. There's a number of negatives to screen play. Obesity is certainly one. As I mentioned before, the sleep issues are there. Poor language development, particularly with kids who are spending a lot of time watching television. Shorter attention span, that can be one of the issues that we see as well. For me, the single biggest issue around too much screen time is the loss of time for other interests. I'm really concerned about kids who aren't exercising. I'm really concerned about kids who don't want to read anymore, who are less interested in art and other kinds of things. I'm very concerned about kids who aren't doing things with their peers, whose socializing is totally consistent of being with other kids online. On the other hand, there are a number of positives. Play is how kids learn. It's just a new form of play. When we talk about play, and we'll touch on something that we call a healthy play diet, we talk about there being 5 types of play. There being physical play, social play, creative play, and unstructured play. And the 5th is digital play. And digital play is here to stay. It's play with screens and technology, and it's a really important part of what kids are doing. And they're learning from this kind of play. There are a number of other positives. Believe it or not, and people have questioned this, but there's some pretty good data on this, that kids are far more creative now than they were in the past. People used to say, oh, they're more creative. Give them a box and some sticks to play with and they'll be creative. Well, they do that to some degree, but give them a video camera to play with and watch what they can do. So there's a lot of, and the research supports it. The kids are actually more creative than they have been in the past. And the reality is that video games and technology are not going to go away. So we've got to figure out some ways to make kids use these effectively. Now, kids will tell you that they don't distract them. That's not true. They'll tell you that they can multitask when they've got their homework and screens. That's not true either. But there are a number of things that are there for kids. And if you look at the slide, you can see some of the things that kids are doing with their technology. Excuse me 1 second here. All right. Okay. So there's certainly some arguments that when kids are playing with other kids, it's much healthier than the passive kind of consumption that they'll have. Next. I'm not seeing the slides. Should I be seeing the slides?
So click the slides tab at the top left of the screen.
Okay. Thank you, Lily. That's one of the things I was struggling with there. Okay. So let's talk about adults. Yes, you adults, you're just as bad as the kids. Common Sense Media has done a bunch of studies. They're finding out that adults are using screens as much as teenagers, about 9.5 hours a day. It's amazing how much time that they're using screens. For adults, it's a little bit different from teenagers. They tend to like listening to the radio a little bit more than teenagers do. They also believe that they know how to model for their kids. And there's a lot of questions about that as to whether they can truly model technology for their kids because of what they're doing. There are some wonderful videos that Common Sense Media has put out, and I encourage you to take a look at those. Actually, I guess we will see one shortly. And but parents are saying that they're concerned, that they know what they're doing, but they're not, okay? 56% say they're concerned about technology addiction now. At the same time, they also feel as if their kids are misusing technology. 36% are concerned about their kids' access to pornography. So screen time is an enormous concern for parents. And not just for parents of kids with ADHD. For example, in Australia, they did a study across the country and found out that the number one health concern for parents of kids was their screen time. And we're seeing similar kinds of things here in the U.S. Next. So can we play this? Lily, is that something that we can play? No. Okay. All right. We were going to try to show you a video, but I guess that's not going to happen. All right. So let's go on to the next slide then. So one question is, should we be concerned about kids with ADHD with their screen time? Should we have special concerns? And the simple answer to that is absolutely yes. I mean, if you just think about the characteristics of kids with ADHD, the kinds of things that kids struggle with when they have ADHD are the kinds of things that we see struggling, that parents struggle with their kids with screens in general. For example, a lot of kids with ADHD struggle with emotional and behavioral regulation. Well, kids who are frustrated with their video games show some of those kinds of things. We know that kids and adults with ADHD are more prone to addiction. Well, that's one of the concerns that we have here as well. One of the things that I think is remarkably consistent with kids with ADHD is how difficult of a time they have in stopping their video gameplay. They can stop their gameplay, but stopping is a real struggle for them. Well, we know the same thing is true for these kids in the real world. Let's say they're just doing an assignment in class and they like doing it, and the teacher wants them to shift and change to something else. They have a hard time shifting attention. It's not so much paying attention, but shifting attention. We also know that impulsivity is an important component of ADHD. Well, we can see some of that in kids' gameplay in terms of how they interact with others in their games as well. Kids with ADHD need constant stimulation. Well, one of the things that happens with video games is they do give constant stimulation, but at some point, maybe it ramps it up so much that that's what they're expecting every place that they have. When we think about video games in terms of kids with ADHD, one of the ways to think about it is that kids with ADHD oftentimes love video games, so they're intending or wanting to play with those things. And a lot of us talk about ADHD as less of a disorder of attention and more of a disorder of intention. So most of the studies that have been done in the past were primarily about video games and not screen times for kids with ADHD. But anecdotally, in my office, I hear about it almost every day. I say to parents when they come in, they bring their kids in for the first time for a neuropsychological assessment. I say to them, tell me about what your kids like. What do you like to do? Well, or if I ask kids, same thing. They almost always I'll hear they love to play video games. Now, interestingly enough, another thing that some of you may recognize is that kids with ADHD oftentimes love to play with Legos as well, and they like manipulatives. They like things that they can do with their hands, but they love to play video games. I hear it all the time: Minecraft, Fortnite. These are the kinds of games, especially those kinds of sandbox games that are endless. They just love doing that. When the research has been done about it, what they found is that kids with ADHD sometimes are not that different from other kids, but there have been some earlier studies suggesting that kids with ADHD actually didn't play the games as well sometimes, not being able to use some of the executive functioning skills. An old study done with teenagers found that teenagers, for the most part with ADHD, played the same amount as their same age peers, except for a small group of those teenagers who played excessively, maybe the kids who at that time showed some addictive qualities. So we know that kids with ADHD like these video games. We also know, and technology, we also know that there's an awful lot they can learn from that. And we want to kind of look at that. And that's really part of what we've been doing at Learning Works for Kids for a number of years, trying to leverage that love of games and technology into something they can learn. One of the things we do right now is we have a program called Learning Works Live, where we actually bring kids to play with us. They might come play Minecraft with one of our game instructors, or they might play some other shorter video games where they're actually practicing skills. And we're trying to help them to recognize how they're using game-based skills such as planning and organization and time management, and how they can translate those skills or generalize those skills to the real world. That's really what our whole focus is on making game-based learning into real-world skills. Next. So here are some of the, here's a slide that talks about some of the difficulties that kids have with problematic behavior in ADHD. So as I was saying to you before, that transition piece is tricky. So one of the studies found that 59% of kids with ADHD will not stop playing video games on their own, as compared to 90% of typically developing kids. So that's a big difference. Another study found that if we tell kids to stop playing, about nearly 100%, now this is not quite true, but this is what they found in the study, of kids without ADHD would stop playing, but only 66% of the kids with ADHD would stop playing. Another study found that kids, and this goes back a ways, and as I was saying to you before, many of the early studies were done with video games. Kids in high school who played for video games for more than an hour displayed higher levels of inattentive symptoms outside of the gameplay, although not necessarily at the level of ADHD. An interesting study done by Gentile found that that the video game type of attention skills, and by the way, you need a lot of attention to play video games, and it can help with certain types of selective attention, but that those skills, while maybe helpful in a video game, were not at all helpful in school, and more of a liability when you're supposed to be paying attention to one thing as opposed to a bunch of things happening on the screen at the same time. So a more recent study is finding that more screen time increases the symptoms of ADHD in teens, so that we're starting to see that the more kids with ADHD play video games, maybe we're starting to see more signs of ADHD and attentiveness. And another study found that there were higher rates of addictive tech use with ADHD adults. So let's go on and talk a little bit about this whole idea of addiction and what we now call internet gaming disorder. Next. So this is a very large concern, and sometimes maybe overly so. There's been a variety of studies on this. There's not a whole lot of experts, and boy, is there a lot of variation of opinion. We see data anywhere from saying 1% of the population to 45% of the population meet the criteria for internet gaming disorder. That's pretty ridiculous in some ways, and probably not at all accurate to think about it there being 45%. However, there are a lot of people who are using technology. There is some evidence that some of these concerns may be larger issues outside of the United States than here. Many of the people who have studied this are suggesting that the real issue has to do with addictive personality more so than the games themselves. For those of you who want to know more about this, I strongly encourage you to look at a book by a guy by the name of Adam Alter. He's a psychologist. It's called Irresistible. And rather than focusing on people and blaming them for addictive stuff, he talks about the tech companies. And he says that basically technology companies have built in things to make these games, technologies, and screens addictive. He says that variable feedback or schedules of reinforcement, that like what they use in slot machines. This is a fascinating thing. He says portability makes them more addictive. Did you realize that 70% of people who have phones have them within their reach without having to walk? And I can't tell you how many times I've had parents tell me that the teenagers seem to have their phones surgically implanted upon them. Technologies have no stopping cues. So those of you who watch Netflix, 5 seconds after the show's over, there's the next one. Artificial goals are set in many of the games and technology. So, for example, the idea of wearing my Fitbit to get 10,000 steps can keep it on me. Alter also talks about there being unresolved cliffhangers. You always need to know what's happening next, so you want to keep going. So when we talk about addiction, in the long run, what happens is someone's well-being is affected. And you look at the criteria here, essentially you really need to look at all of these things happening and having a large impairment. Next. For kids with ADHD and for kids in general, I think it's important that we recognize that most kids who love video games are not addicted. However, that's not to say there's some concerns and problems. This is a recent study that was done in Norway. In their study, they only found about 1.5% of the people I think teens, were addicted. However, they found 7% being problem gamers. And these are people who acknowledged modest difficulties with some of these symptoms of addiction, such as having some withdrawal and some conflicts and problems due to gameplay, but they weren't addicted. They weren't stuck on this, and wasn't the only thing, and it wasn't impairing them to the degree that they were no longer functioning very well. But then there's a lot of other kids. Some of them we can call engaged gamers. It's about 4% of the population. There's no relationship with any real issues. But they do display some difficulties of increased difficulty with physical health. My guess is that this is probably about sleep issues more than anything else, because that's what happens. Obsessed gamers, highly involved gamers, they love the game and they spend much of their time thinking about the gameplay, but it's not interfering with school or work of their peers. And then another category we could talk about is passionate gamers. They'll describe themselves as gamers. This is what they love to do. And playing these games fits with them. It's consistent with their personality. And perhaps these are some kids that may make a living with this. And by the way, just a quick aside with this, there's going to be a lot of game-based jobs in the future. I mean, there's esports now, which draws thousands, hundreds of thousands of spectators. There are teams. There's publicity for these teams. There's training. There's marketing. This is a whole other. Think about it as sports. There's a whole other range of activities and jobs that people can have. So if kids love games, we might be able to direct them towards those things. Okay, I'm done. James, you're up.
All right. So I'm going to talk for a little bit about the different strategies we recommend for dealing with screen time, for managing your child's screen time. Before I get into all that, I just want to take a minute to talk a bit more about the benefits of screen time, in part because it's often what we hear that parents think their sole job really regarding technology is to be the warden, to just limit it. That's really the main thing that they need to do. And I'm going to talk about that. That is really important to be the person who turns off the iPad when it's time to turn it off. But it's also really important to recognize that there are benefits to screen time, and just turning it off all the time is not necessarily a holistic way of managing screen time. So just a few of the benefits that we like to remind everybody of. Number one, this idea of 21st century skills and digital literacy. Being able to use technology, being able to use it well and easily, and have a good understanding both of the language of digital literacy and social media, as well as the actual technical usage of it. And I'm not even talking about things like coding or computer science. Just basic facility with digital technology is incredibly important for kids graduating high school and college today, and is going to continue to become more and more important. So we do want to keep in mind that even while they are spending so much screen time, they are developing their digital literacy in a way that's going to serve them someday. Also, there's a lot of games and apps that can be used to teach lots of skills. We use it at LearningWorks for Kids to teach executive functioning and thinking skills, which we do with a variety of different ways. Randy had mentioned our LearningWorks Live program, where people actually get together with instructors online and talk about different ways to use technology to improve thinking skills. But we also have guides that we offer people, and lots of different resources that parents can use to use those to improve executive functions. But as well, there's all of the just good things that they can be doing right now. I mean, whether it is using YouTube to learn how to play an instrument. My daughter just learned how to play a song on the piano just by watching YouTube videos and practice, and she doesn't really even play piano, which in and of itself is a great creative thing to do, but also is something that requires a certain amount of technology in order to do it. Go ahead and go to the next slide. So those are just a few of the overall benefits. Now here's an overview of some of the solutions that we talk about for screen time. And I'm going to get into a lot of these in more detail. I've been looking through some of your questions. I know a lot of the questions focus on these kind of things. So if I don't hit anything in this section, then we'll certainly try to address them in the question and answer section. But overall ideas for how to manage screen time. First of all, when it comes to things like violence and content, you have to stick to your own values for that. Nobody is going to give you anything better than your own sensibility when it comes to, what is appropriate for your child. You're the only one who knows your child, and that child has to live in your house with your values. So that's just the first thing right away. Just because something says it's okay for teen, on, say, a video game rating, that doesn't mean that it's okay for your teen. Similarly, there's some things that are mature content that you might think are perfectly fine for your kid, especially if you are doing it with them, for example. So we definitely encourage you to come up with your own ideas for what's the right kind of content and stick to those, just as you would have with movies or TV or anything else. Modeling is huge. I'm going to talk about that a lot here, but make sure that they see you using screen time the way you want them to use screen time, both in terms of when it's time to put down the phone or the iPad, and also make sure that they see you using it for good stuff. Make sure they see you using it to make your life better and to get work done and be productive, in addition to just using it to have fun and play games or communicate with people. Try to learn about the things that they're doing with technology. If you see them using an app that you've never heard of before, or they talk about something they use at school, try and learn as much as you can about those. Finally, make sure you do use games and technology with your kids. Don't just limit and tell them what to do with it. Make sure and, like I said, learn about it, but also actually use it with them. Take the time to sit down together with computer, iPad, whatever game, and make sure to spend some time together doing things so that you can have that kind of a conversation. And I'm going to get into a lot of these in a bit more detail. We can go to the next slide, which is where we start talking about modeling. And modeling is really so important. As Randy said earlier, the parents are often just as bad as kids when it comes to a lot of these things. And there's really, your kids are going to know, especially as they get into teenagers, that if you're not doing something and you're telling them to do it, they're going to know and they're going to call you on it. And more to the point, they're probably not going to listen to something that you tell them if you're not at least showing them that you can do something similar. So we have a few different tips here. First of all, make sure you're just kind of watching, pay attention, use the apps, get the data about what your kids are using. And I'll talk a bit more about how to get that data in a little bit, but make sure you have a good idea of what they're doing. Model good screen time. Like I said, don't just know when to turn it off. It's obviously really important that, if you're telling them to, an obvious one is to not have a phone out at the dinner table. But if you get a work text in the middle of dinner and you have to take it, which does happen from time to time, make sure you explain that this is a really particular and specific situation where I need to take this text from work because of something that's going on, but it's still not okay to do that at the table. And if you can't make that kind of a point, then don't pick up your phone at the table. Make sure they see you doing the same things. Similarly, engage in other stuff. Don't just use your phone as your relaxing time. If they see you finish up work and sit down on the couch with your phone or your iPad and not do anything else, then it's probably what they're going to do as well. No matter what we do as parents, we don't do anything as effectively as we do model behavior. And the more that we model the behavior we want them to use with technology, the more they will. but especially, I mean, I hear all the time about parents who are always telling their kids, get off the phone and go outside and play, go for a walk, go for a run. And then you ask the parent, well, when was the last time you went outside to play? When was the last time you went outside for a run or to go for a bike ride? And it's like, well, maybe that's been a few years. Make them see you doing that. Then it's so much easier for them to listen to you and do it yourself. Finally, make sure that you are talking about screen time itself on a regular basis with your kids, that it's a good back and forth, and listen and observe to what they're doing, what they're thinking, how they're talking about their own screen time use, how they talk about other parents and what they do. You want to kind of keep that conversation and observation open, in part because this is all so new for everybody. I know a lot of people feel like, their house is uniquely loud and horrible because of all the yelling and screaming that happens around screen time, but this is the entire generation of kids growing up right now, and their parents are dealing with the same thing. I'm dealing with it every day in my house as well, with late night arguments over TikTok time. So just keep your eyes open and understand that this is all kind of getting worked out as we go. All right, next slide. Play together. This is really one of our biggest points that we like to make to parents, is that it's not just enough to give your kids rules. It's not just enough to try and have an understanding of what they're doing, but actually using these games and apps with them. And ideally in a way that you like to do it. Try to find something that they do that you like to do. I know, for example, I'm not as interested in social media. So my wife has a TikTok account so that she can see what my daughter is doing, and they will get in bed sometimes and just, look at funny things on TikTok together and laugh and talk about it, or talk about people who are being, rude or obnoxious, or, using TikTok in a way that we wouldn't want her to use. And I take the other side of things. I tend to do more of the gaming. If there is some new or, creative music or photo app, then I'll get that, and I'll make sure that I actually use it with her. We sit down a lot of nights and play a game called Life is Strange. I don't know if anyone's ever played that. It's a really good game. It's a bit mature. It's probably a bit more mature than I would even let my daughter play on her own. But because we're playing it together, we can talk about a lot of the issues that it raises. And that's really so important to actually take that time to use it with them. Because not only will you learn about the technology, but it gives you a real ability to talk to them about what they're doing, to understand why, for example, they might not want to turn something off in the middle of a video they're recording or a game they're playing. It can let you at least have the vocabulary to understand and to talk to them a bit more about their usage. All right, we'll do the next slide here. Play diet. I'm going to let Randy come into this. You still there, Randy?
I am back.
All right. Yeah, maybe you wanted to talk about play diet. Yeah.
I do want to talk about play diet. So actually, I want to talk about playing together for just a minute, because I think that another piece to that is, and I think you were saying this, is talking together as well, is that you want to have conversations with your kids about their use of technology. Let them ask you questions about what you're doing as well. I think that this is important to have, because we're all involved with this technology. It's not going away. I wish I could tell you it was going away to some degree, although at the same time, it opens up so many doors for our kids and for ourselves, for that matter. I mean, I find so many wonderful uses of technology beyond watching football games on the television, but that I really enjoy in terms of like writing and other kinds of things. And one of the things I just got finished doing, and I'm proud to say I have a new book coming out. It's called the Gaming Overload Workbook. It's coming out in the summer. It's published by New Harbinger Publications, and it's basically a book for teenagers to have discussions with their parents about their use of games and technology. And it's a very sort of open book to kids to say to them, hey, it's cool that you use games and technology, but there's other things in life too. And let's think about that, because what you'll find if you talk to kids, you might find that some of your kids are saying, you know what? I'm spending too much time with my technology. Some of the most recent data from Common Sense Media that's done all these great studies found that 56% of teenagers feel as if they're spending too much time with their screens. So if you confront them, they'll deny it and they'll fight you. If you talk to them, on the other hand, you might find that they don't disagree with that being a concern. So that leads us to a play diet. And again, I go back to kind of my own interest in play when I developed this concept 10, 15 years ago. The idea was that video game play is just another form of play. It's actually can be healthy and can be useful, but one needs to have a healthy play diet, just like you need to have a healthy food diet. Okay, if you eat too much broccoli or beans, well, I don't want to tell you what happens, but it's not pleasant. The same thing is true for spending too much time playing video games. So for that matter, even spending too much time socializing and not doing other kinds of things. So, having some physical play, some social play, creative play, unstructured play, and digital play is really important. The problem that people have in trying to get their kids to have a healthy play diet is that these games and technologies are so immersive. They're so addictive, if we can use that term here. They really grab kids, and not only the kids, but the parents. And as we've said before, they're right there with them. They might be surgically attached to them. They can't get away from them. So it really means that parents need to use some different strategies if they want to make their kids do this. Some of them have to do with what we talked about earlier, modeling. I mean, if you model having other interests, if you are a gardener, if you read, if you exercise regularly, if you play an instrument, if you like going to museums, modeling that stuff is the best way to get kids to start doing that kind of stuff. But that's not enough either. So a lot of it has to do with having time, money, and making the effort to do this. You've got to really make other things more interesting and engaging than games and technology. I mean, games and technology are incredibly interesting. So if you're a parent and you want to really make a healthy play diet happen, you've got to be committed to it. And and like I said, you've got to spend money. You've got to invite a bunch of kids over to your house, your kids' friends over to the house, and have something else you're going to do. You're going to go to the beach today. You're going to take them all to the beach, and you're going to stop and get pizza. You got to make it interesting, because this other stuff that kids are doing is so engaging and so immersive to them. The other way to make this happen is something that I started to write about, and that's hopefully going to be my newest new book, and I call it whole play. And what I mean by whole play is play that integrates different forms of play, and that in this case specifically uses games and technology to increase other kinds of play. So, for example, I don't know how many of you remember it was either 3 or 4 summers ago, there was the Pokemon Go craze. Everybody was playing Pokemon Go. Well, what I loved about Pokemon Go is that it was oftentimes a family thing, and it involved exercise. You had to walk. You had to go places. You couldn't do it in a car. You could ride a bike, but you couldn't do it in a car. And whole play is the kind of thing that allows you to use technology to engage in other kinds of play. So, for example, when I see kids who are making videos for YouTube, they're using whole play. They're engaged in creative play, but they're using technology. When you use your Fitbit and other kinds of things to monitor your exercise, whole play again. You've got technology, you've got a screen, it's engaging you with other play. And there's a list of many other kinds of things that we can do for whole play. So we actually take that technology and use that as a way to leverage kids into doing other kinds of things. So we don't get, and in fact, if you think about it, some of the kind of play that kids do now that we would consider to be whole play is some of their online gameplay where they're playing with their friends. They're on Discord talking to each other, and they're coming into school talking about it the next day. So it's a kind of a social play as well as a digital play. Okay, James, I'm going to turn it back to you.
Thank you. You can go ahead and go to the next slide. All right, I'm only going to take a second on this one because the next couple of slides are really just about different strategies for managing screen time. And I know that the slide after this one is the one that most people are probably going to want to hear me talk about based on some of the questions coming up here. But curation of content, what we mean by that is mostly taking the time to actually choose what kind of games, apps, and technology your child gets to use and should use and has to use even, and making the selection of that content more important than the amount of time played on it necessarily. So, for example, if you fill an iPad only with educational games, or games that you are okay with them playing longer than other things, then you can be a little bit more flexible with the actual time. In general, this can be helpful. I don't necessarily think it is something that can be used in isolation without other strategies as well, like we'll talk about in a second. But it is a good idea to to the degree that you feel comfortable and can get that information to not only choose which games and apps your child isn't allowed to have, which is something kind of everybody does anyway, because there's all sorts of things we want to keep our kids safe from, but also the things you are going to encourage them to use. And we have a lot of tools on our website at Learning Works for Kids for finding games and apps to meet different kind of educational needs, things that will be fun and good for something or another. But that's the general idea of curation of content. It's a good idea to just try and really learn as much as you can about all the different things your kid is using. Go ahead and go to the next slide. Now, the actual amount of time given to kids for screen time is something a lot of the questions in the fee here are about. And I know it's what most of us as parents spend our times worrying about. And first of all, there is no definitive answer. There is, to my knowledge, no one has yet come up with an exact number of hours and minutes that is healthy, less or more than that is not good. So we're all kind of doing our best here, and we're all doing our best knowing what we can about our own kids. An hour a day tends to be what most people choose who choose this kind of a schedule, who choose to just limit the time and kind of keep it at that. They say an hour a day seems reasonable. One thing that you have to keep in mind with that can be very difficult is that there are a lot of things that use screens that you want your kid to do. You want them to be able to talk to you if they're out of the house and need to get in touch. You want them to be able to do their homework online because so much homework is signed with a computer and online now. So you do have to manage that hour within that context as well. It doesn't make sense to give a kid an hour of screen time after school, but if they have an hour and a half of homework that requires the internet, you can't really count that as well. So a few of the common things that people do: an hour a day, saying after homework is done. So once all your responsibilities are done, then you can have either unlimited until bedtime, which seems like a bit much, or maybe the hour doesn't start until that point. Other people do weekends and vacations. That can be a little hard during the week because the screen time can give them certain social things that they want to be doing on a regular basis. Now, I can tell you that what we do in my house, and this is just one person, and like I said earlier, there's still plenty of screaming in my house, so it's not like we have this figured out. But we tend to do, a few minutes after school, maybe 15 minutes, and then it goes off until all of the homework is done, and then there is some limited amount of time, depends on what's going on that day, but it's usually about an hour. Again, that is really kid dependent, though. I know a lot of people have asked, what about taking the screen time away? How do you do that in a way that doesn't make kids yell and scream and act like it's some big punishment that you're giving them? And I don't know that there is really a good answer to that. I have yet to meet any parent who has figured out how to take a screen away from your kid without annoying them at least a little bit. I do know that when you have set rules that are consistent and logical, and the kid understands what they are and why they are there, or at the very least understands that these are what the rules are, then simply following those rules on a regular basis does tend to decrease the amount of yelling and screaming because you're doing the same thing every day. If it's an hour, then it's an hour. If that hour is up, then the hour is up. If you are consistent with that, then that can make it better. Now, one of the other things that can help a lot, and you can go ahead and move to the next slide now, is the use of some of the apps that can help you with screen time. It is certainly a lot easier to get to the end of that screen time allotment when the end comes by their phone telling them they're out of screen time than by you as a parent telling them they're out of screen time. They might still yell at you, but they'll probably be a few rooms away or something, so it won't be quite as annoying. Apple screen time is on every Apple iPhone. That's a pretty standard way to go for screen time management. It gives you updated information about everything that they've done, how much time they've spent on every app on their phone, and you can hook it up so that if they have a phone, a website, a computer, that it's tracking all of those things together. It will give you let you set limits by category. So, for example, you can let somebody have more time with educational things and less time with social media or whatnot. You can obviously control different kinds of content, say that they're not allowed to download or use any adult apps or go to any adult websites. All of those things are really good. It also does have, most importantly, downtime and overall app limiting. So downtime is where you say from, let's say 10 p.m. until 8 a.m. that the phone is just off, or everything is off except for example, the phone and messaging. I know we usually leave on the phone and messaging regardless of what the screen time locks out, so that our daughter can always get in touch with us. But if your child's main problem is that they're up late texting their friends at night, then maybe you don't want to leave on the messaging. But it does allow you to keep on certain things and have everything else go off at night. It also will let you set an overall time limit for the day. So an hour a day, 2 hours a day, 1 hour and 12 minutes a day. You can be as specific as you want, or limits for specific categories. So like I said before, you can have an hour of social media and then another hour of gaming, or, maybe half an hour of social media and everything else is unlimited. Maybe if you've got a kid who mostly does use their technology for schoolwork or for interests that you approve of, but sometimes they just get sucked into TikTok and stay on there for way too long, then you can just say the only limit on the phone is half an hour TikTok a day. Those are the kind of things you can do with Apple Screen Time. It's not the easiest app to use. I will post on, we've got a page for the webinar here. It's just learningworksforkids.com/attitude, ADDITUDE. I don't have it up there. The page is up there now, but I don't have any information about Apple Screen Time up there yet, but I'll go ahead and put some kind of a tutorial up there about how to actually get started for people who are not yet started with Apple Screen Time. That only works with Apple devices. If you have Google devices, sorry, you can advance the slide. I'm not sure if I did that myself. Google Family Link is another, it's a very similar kind of an app, but for Google phones, Android phones, it's a little bit easier to use in some ways. It doesn't quite have all the granularity in terms of what you can control. But again, it's a good way to at least be able to put some overall limits so that the technology is turning the off button and not the parent turning the off button, because that does tend to make a big difference in terms of the amount of vitriol that gets spouted at you. Don't get me wrong, your child probably will still come barging into the room. Why did you turn off my screen time? But that's the way it is. I can say from experience, from the things that we hear from lots of parents, is that far and away the best way to decrease the drama in your household surrounding screen time is with consistency, is to figure out what the rules are, talk to your kid about the rules. If that means making the rules a little bit more lax than maybe you otherwise would have, but keeping them consistent, then that's a good idea and a good thing to do. But consistency is the most important. Go ahead and advance the slide. All right, finally we get to the last slide here, which is it's kind of a weird look to it, but talk a little bit about the Learning Works for Kids model for how we make screens good for kids. I know Randy's going to want to jump in on this as well in a minute, but basically what we do is we try and use strategic teaching principles to make the technologies the kids are already using actually good. And the basic idea about that is just the this detect, reflect, and connect process where, and you can do this at home as well. It's what we do in our LearningWorks live sessions, specifically around certain issues or technologies, but all technology is going to use certain skills. It's going to use certain executive functions. And if you can talk to the kid beforehand about the things that they're going to be doing before they use the app, and then make sure that they are being metacognitive afterwards and thinking about it, and then finding ways to connect the types of things they're doing in technology or games with the things that they need to do in the real world, even if it's something like, focusing on a video game for 3 hours while they can't focus on a class for 20 minutes, trying to connect how it's not so different if they can just make that choice to pay attention. Then you can use some of this detect, reflect, connect at home. Randy, do you want to add anything to the LearningWorks model?
Well, I think we need time for questions. The simple explanation is that what we suggest we try to do, or you as parents or teachers, and what we do at LearningWorks for Kids, is we try to help the kids recognize the skills they're using in games and understand, think about, or reflect how they can use those in the real world, and then actually practice those skills. So we think about games as an opportunity to practice skills that they could be used in the real world, just like you would when you teach your kid sportsmanship when they're playing baseball or soccer, and you teach them to do that with other things. So we're trying to encourage parents and educators to use these places that the kids are already at as a tool for teaching them. So we're ready for questions.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thanks so much, guys. Listeners, please post your questions. I see lots of great questions here, but this is your chance. So let me just jump right in. I'm sure what I'm going to say is something you've heard before. There are a number of people who say they have a schedule. They try to enforce it, but it's very difficult. Either it is absolutely ignored, or there's enormously difficult pushback, or third, their child manages to get around whatever controls they have put on the computer or the screen time. Any suggestions for that sort of really serious resistance the parents are facing as they attempt to make put this screen diet in place?
Sure. So obviously, some of these recommendations are not necessarily the real world recommendations, because kids are tough, and if you can, start early. So, but beyond that, once you haven't started early, I think that's where some of these tools can play a role. A second part that can play a role is really having the discussions with the kids to make that kind of stuff happen. A third thing that you can do is families can sort of own the technology. I mean, if kids get a phone, the parents are always paying for that phone. That phone may need to be in their bedroom, in the parents' bedroom, or that phone may need to be shut off because you've called your cell phone carrier to shut it off. When it really gets bad, people go to see a therapist, and they work on some of these issues to set limits. I mean, these issues are not unique to technology. The problem with technology is, as I was saying earlier, is that the technology is so addictive and so immersive, and it's just like it pulls kids in. It's like they really struggle. I mean, one of the things that happened recently with a different kid that came into my office is that this is a kid, again, a teenage girl who never had any issues whatsoever in school. They changed the rules about cell phones. She had her cell phone out. Her teacher took the cell phone away. The kid totally lost it. I mean, it was explosive. At one point, the police were called because she lost her cell phone. Never a problem before. And part of that has to do with the power of these technologies. And I think we need to recognize that. And they're not going away, so we need to deal with it. We need to be thinking about that. And it presents a whole other set of issues.
Yeah, it's very tough. Yep.
I would just add to that I do think that it is universal to some degree that kids are really resistant. I have found, on the one hand, just to echo what Randy said about, when necessary, finding therapy or professional help, only in that whatever issues are going on in a house or between a parent and a child are going to be drastically magnified by this technology issue, especially the taking away of technology. So if there are other things that need to be worked out, then it might be coming out here, and that just might be a way to see that. But beyond that, I definitely am a big fan of as the parent, as the person paying for this or in control of it, that you should have the passwords and the basic ability to change any password, open or close any account. If you can do that, then you at least have the ability to just shut it all down if it really gets that far where you need to shut it all down. I mean, delete their phone or anything like that. And then I tend to say, be consistent. When in doubt, and this is just what I do in my house, it's not maybe right for all parents, but I tend to say I'd rather give my child a little bit more time than maybe my wife thinks is always appropriate, but we can be consistent about it. And when that time is over, then it's over. And if you can maintain that consistency, sometimes being a little bit flexible with the amount of time, but making sure that when it's over, it's actually over, can be a way to compromise and move forward in a way that's healthy for the family. But yeah, I mean, just communication, this is something we're all going through. We're all trying. I don't even know. In my house, TikTok made everything a million times worse. I don't know if anybody else is experiencing that out there. We had the issue, and then all of a sudden, TikTok is the thing that gets my daughter to scream at me at 11 o'clock at night because she figured out some way to break in. And they will always figure out a way. Those apps that I showed you are good. There's always going to be a way around them. There's really no way to ensure that you are going to be one step ahead of your kids on this. But you can use that as a lot of good opportunities for conversations about trust and other things. I mean, if my daughter sneaks her phone or figures out a way to enter in a passcode to get more time, then we talk about, how that's going to affect us letting her do other things in the future, or, go to a dance this weekend or something else, because now we have this trust issue that came up because she's trying to guess our codes. So I would like to empower parents to some degree, just not to be super scared about the technology side of it. A lot of this is kind of like a lot of other parenting things where it's, have rules, be consistent.
One thing that comes up here, and we've heard this from other experts, would you advocate, or do you see this working in your practice, using screen time as either a reward or a consequence for negative behavior?
So that's a fascinating question, and one that I have mixed feelings about.
Mm-hmm.
Part of what I like to say is that games and technology should not be considered dessert. When I was growing up, you had dessert after you ate your meat and potatoes or whatever that was. I don't think that we should simply use it as dessert. I think we could use it as a second dessert, if you will. But that having access to games and technology should be part of what kids have. If for no other reason, it's part of how they connect with others. Either they're communicating with them, they're playing games with them, they're part of what's happening with other kids. However, I do think using it as a consequence, certainly for using it inappropriately, for arguing about it and those kinds of things, that you can lose some of it. So I think that losing some of it makes sense. So I'm more apt to kind of say, use it as a consequence if it's misused, but not so much simply as the only reward. I think that they should have access to it regardless of anything, but you could minimize that. That could be, that's one of the ways to do that too, is, you could say, all right, you get 45 minutes a day, but you can earn another 45 minutes a day. Yeah. So that would be sort of my approach to this.
That's what we do. We do the earning extra time, like especially on weekends or in the summertime. If there's an hour as the standard amount of time, and that gets used up, then take the dog for a 45-minute walk and get yourself another 45 minutes, or practice piano or clean your room or do something else to earn more time. I think that there's a lot of questions about the idea of using it as dessert or how much you want to limit, but I don't know. We have so few tools in our arsenal as parents against all this screen time stuff that the reward and and punishment seems a little too powerful to pass up all the time.
Right.
And I think that it's such a universal issue that it speaks again to the power of these technologies. I think that that's part of what we need to recognize. And then for kids with ADHD, they're even more powerful. So I think that we need to recognize that and look at it like that rather than blaming the kids and say, you bad kid, you just won't give this up. It's like, what about this is making this happen? And also being realistic, because we can say, what about it? We say, oh, we'll take it away. Well, good luck. It's not going away. It's just not going to go away. And it's actually not healthy for your kids to not have access to it. With the small exception of kids who have true addictions to this. And then maybe at times they need to be away from that.
Right. I know we don't have much time left. I'll just come back to a simple question that I know is important to everybody. And that's, if we talk about 45 minutes or an hour a day of, strictly really gaming, what about kids under 5 or elementary school kids? Do you tend to see a gaming or a screen time budget that varies by the age of the child? We have some people with 4-year-olds here who they're worried about on screens.
Sure. Yeah. Well, developmentally, I think that as kids get older, they just need more access to screens. When we're talking specific, and it's hard. Like, again, one of the first things I said today was, when we talk about screen time, it's all very different. It's so, but most of the screen time that we're talking about now is, I'll call it recreational screen time as opposed to necessarily gaming. But sure, younger kids should have less time. It should be far more supervised. It should be far more of joint media engagement when it's with parents. And realistically, we can say 45 minutes to an hour a day, but there aren't a whole lot of teenagers who are spending only 45 minutes to an hour a day with screen time. What we're saying when we say that is that should be, pure recreational time. There's other times that kids are going to be using screens. It's just, I think right. if a parent leaves this webinar and saying, oh my God, I'm doing a terrible job. My kids, spending 3 hours a day on their technology, but they're still doing okay in school and doing well with other things. Don't beat yourself up, because that's more, if we look at what's really realistic is kids are spending even more time than that. So this idea about an hour, 45 minutes, an hour and a half a day, what the data tells us, and it's pretty clear, there's some pretty compelling studies, especially some studies that came out of Great Britain, that an hour a day is actually good for kids. 3 hours a day, this is more like video game play, or more, is actually bad for their mental health. Someplace in between probably doesn't have a whole lot of impact. And this is data looking at tens of thousands of kids. And by the way, there's also a lot of studies that came out recently that have been talking about depression and screen time. And then since then, there have been some reanalysis of many of these studies. The most recent stuff that I read suggests that there's a tiny variation there based upon kids spending a lot of time with screens and depression, but the causality is unclear. So even there, it's questionable.
Okay, great. Randy, do you want to just mention the name of your book or upcoming book that might be of interest to the listeners, since we had, little time to answer so many questions?
Sure. Thank you, Susan. I appreciate that. Yeah, it's called The Gaming Overload Workbook. It's a book by New Harbinger Publications, and it's really written as a conversation piece, if you will, for parents, teenagers, clinicians, teachers with teenagers. So it's really written for teenagers with this idea of accepting their use of technology, but trying to engage them in discussions about it. So I think a lot of teenagers are going to look at this book and say, oh, this makes sense. Yeah. And they'll be willing to talk to the parents about it because it's so hard to have these conversations. So that's one of the things we need to do.
That's great. Anything that will help parents talk with their kids about this will be very helpful. Thanks, everybody, for listening in today. I want to remind you about Play Attention, our sponsor, and their special offer, Attitude Mag 0220, to receive 10% off a professional program and a free ADHD assessment, 1-800-788-6786. playattention.com. Thank you so much, Randy and James. As always, you were extremely helpful and realistic, so we appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Bye.